Hello, everyone, and welcome to earthday.org's webinar series. We're really excited to have an esteemed group of panelists and a wonderful moderator for today's discussion. I'm Jillian. I am with Earth Day Network. I am the Director of Food and Environment. We're really excited about this discussion as tomorrow is World Food Day, to have this topic, to talk about food security issues, to talk about regenerative agriculture, risk and behaviors in food and environment is really an important discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to our youth climate activist, Lana, who will kick off the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Jillian. I want to start by introducing some of our wonderful panelists today who we are going to be hearing from. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sweta, a risk and behavioral scientist and U.S. representative of We Don't Have Time, the Sweden-based tech startup that launched Greta Thunberg to viral global renown. We're also going to be hearing from Max Finberg, president and CEO of Growing Hope Globally, a faith-based organization dedicated to ending hunger by supporting farmers and their food security. Another panelist we have with us today is Linus, a distinguished professor at Stellenbosch University and president of CIGR, the International Commission of Agriculture and Biosystems Engineering. You've already heard a little bit from Jillian, who's the Director of Food and Agriculture at Earth Day Network, where she focuses on addressing the impact animal agriculture has on the planet. And Jillian also formerly served as the Chief of Staff of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And lastly, but not least, we have Anna joining us from the Regenerative Organic Alliance. So excited to hear from all of these panelists, and thank you to everyone who's joining us right now. We are gathered here on the eve of World Food Day tomorrow, discussing food security, hunger, and how we can build our food systems by making them more sustainable, more resilient, especially in a time of global pandemic. We're also gathered here 1 year before the UN Food Systems Summit for 2021, which I want to highlight as a key international opportunity to elevate the public discourse on the importance of food systems and yield significant action across government, private sector, and civil society, with measurable outcomes to enable achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're all part of food systems, and so we're all invited to be involved in these dialogues. With that, I'm looking forward to jumping into our panel today and getting started with our questions for our panelists. My first question is for Max, and that is, around the world, more than enough food is produced to feed the global population, but more than 690 million people still go hungry. After steadily declining for a decade, world hunger is on the rise, affecting 8.9% of people globally. Max, what can be done to address this issue, and how have we not figured out a solution yet?
Thank you, Lana, and thanks Earth Day for organizing this, and for all of you for joining all around the world. As you said, tomorrow is World Food Day, the birthday or the anniversary of the founding of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. And as folks might have picked up on last week, their sister organization, my former employer, the UN's World Food Program, won the Nobel Peace Prize for 2020. And the reason the Nobel Committee chose them is because hunger has a cure. In the richest environment we've ever been in, the most wealth the world has ever created, the fact that 1 out of 11 of our brothers and sisters globally go hungry, as you just noted, Lana, is a tragedy. There is more than enough food in the world. It's just not well distributed. So one of the ways that we need to continue to cast that spotlight on the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, the goal of ending hunger, And number one is addressing poverty, but number two is zero hunger by 2030. We got 10 years. The only way we do that, the only way we can achieve that is by addressing the triple threats. Well, now there are four. And they're alliterative, so it'll make it easy. Conflict. 3 out of 5 of those hungry people live in conflict zones. We cannot end hunger without peace. Second is climate change. There is no doubt that the extreme changes to climate, whether that's extreme weather or drought or otherwise, has impacted our trying to address global hunger. Third is corruption. We can't do our work if governments are corrupt. And fourth, as we know, is COVID. So the extreme hunger, those on the brink of starvation, is expected to double this year because of the pandemic. So those are a few of the things, a few of the reasons, but there is hope. As you noted, we've made great progress overall in the last couple of decades. We met the Millennium Development Goal of cutting hunger in half. Great. So that was between 2000 and 2015. The Sustainable Development Goal, we're 5 years in, we got a decade to go. We need everybody putting their shoulder to the wheel, as it were, to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Max. A very comprehensive answer. Next, I want to ask a question to Sweta, which is, are there comparable factors on a global scale that could facilitate the creation of more integrative, adaptive, and resilient policies to manage our global food system?
Yeah, great question. And awesome job pronouncing my name, because it's not obvious from the spelling. Very, very impressed. So there's a lot of cross-cultural differences, and there's no uniform one solution fits all. And I think that's obvious to people. We've known since SARS the fragility of our food systems, and yet there's been very little in addressing the immunodeficiencies that have become really clear and obvious post-COVID. So much of the outcomes have been dependent on people's existing health states, the comorbidities that they suffer from. And that really comes down a lot to diet, which is linked to cultural practices, which varies across the world. So culture really informs behavior, it informs decision-making about food choices. And there is something to be said for what we know now from decades of research and what we are increasingly learning as COVID is continuing and as we anticipate the next big disease outbreak. One thing that's critical to keep in mind is that all the best science points to, this is the new normal in terms of infectious disease. It's not one and done. It's not, we're going to have COVID, we're going to have a vaccine, and then we're going to begin to go back to life as normal. There's absolutely nothing true about, there's nothing that suggests business as usual. And that was from that transformative food systems report that was just released as well, leading up to the summit for next year. And so putting all of that into context, it means we really need to be proactive, recognizing that there will inevitably be another infectious disease outbreak. They are increasing in frequency and probability as the planet is warming. And we need to take this time while we have the world's attention around COVID-19 to really put in place practices, behaviors, and norms that persist. Because what you will remember from SARS, if anything, this is what I study in terms of the brain, and the unfortunate truth that we don't have great long-term recall is we don't have good long-term recall. Post-SARS, post-MERS, post-swine flu, do any, panelists and audience who's listening in, do you remember? Do you remember the fear you had? Do you remember how long that persisted? Do you remember when you kind of went back to default status? So because our brains do not allow us to maintain that level of awareness around the realities of climate, around the realities of our complex interactions, around the realities of infectious disease outbreaks, we need to take advantage of the fact that we are thinking about it right here and right now. So this is the time to put those behaviors and norms in place while recognizing the unique cultural differences across borders and creating diplomatic discourse and engagement. So I don't propose to know exactly what that is. I know it shouldn't be uniform across borders, but I do know it requires engagement and it requires systematic dissemination. And that is something we've, again, known at least since SARS, but we definitely know now, and we don't have the luxury of no longer doing. What I'm looking forward to in the coming year is the amount of engagement that is already scheduled in with different public organizations across countries and cultures. So I see a lot of hope here for this.
Thank you, Sweta. Yeah, you actually mentioned those infectious diseases, and it's funny because I don't remember those. It might have been from before my time, but I've been saying that food systems are connected to a lot of these major issues, right? From climate change to infectious diseases. And it really took a global pandemic for some more attention to come to the issue. Hopefully it's enough. Next, I'm going to go to Linus for our question. Linus, you published a highly cited article on food traceability from farm to plate in response to global crises due to foodborne illness and related deaths. These concerns have been exacerbated by several factors, including the trend towards further globalization of the food supply chain. Can you talk about solutions and the trajectory moving forward from here? Linus, you're muted.
Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on this very, very important topic. I think the pandemic that we are facing now, which is the reason why I'm talking to you from Nigeria, actually my village in southeastern Nigeria, has clearly thrown some balls in the air for us to try to juggle and try to catch. Back in the early 2000s, when I was based at the FAO in Rome, we had these foodborne illnesses, and we talked about SARS. And Sweta just reminded us whether we could remember or not. I think I remember very little, not much. And I agree with you about our ability to forget, and that hinders our ability to be very, very innovative to deal with modern pandemics like we face today. So the issue of food traceability has to do with our food system. So we cannot talk about food traceability without talking about our food system. The way we produce, the way we consume, the way we distribute, and the way we handle. I think it's very, very important to look at it from that system's point of view. Now, with globalization, it means that we have to think differently. So just like the current pandemic means that wherever the problem started, I was not able to go back to my office in Stellenbosch University the time that I wanted. And that even if I wanted to go back to Stellenbosch, there are new rules and guidelines of operation now that will now determine whether I actually go back or not, in terms of testing, in terms of access to technology, in terms of the accuracy of information, in terms of the fear and the panic and all associated issues, which may or may not be true, but they are real, because that is how we all respond to these kind of situations. So what does that mean with respect to food traceability, emergent problems like the pandemic, and our ability to manage a global food system? Or should we even at all try to manage a global food system? We have to ask those hard questions. And I just want to make a case in point that I am based in the African continent, and we boast of the largest number of smallholder farmers, millions that are scattered around villages and all over the continent, trying to provide food. And the current statistics, which I can challenge my colleagues to prove to me in the current situation, that they produce about 80% of the food that's consumed in Africa. But if you consider that a continent of about 1.2 billion people spends about $40 billion US every year importing processed food from the rest of the world. And that the same continent loses about $48 billion of food that does not get to its consumers because of inadequate post-harvest handling practices and other factors. So you have a challenge here under globalization. And I will tell you that when I left Nigeria exactly 31 years ago and went to live in New Zealand to do my PhD, I never saw an apple in Nigeria. But if you come to any nook and corner of Nigeria, you see apples and table grapes from Europe and South Africa all over this place. That's about sign of a globalized food system. Bananas that come from Costa Rica, from Philippines, and all over the places. So there is something going on about the globalization of the food system. So my contribution and challenge in our discussion today now is, what is the role, what is the future of these smallholder farmers? Should they be mainstreamed into the global food system? Should they follow a different trajectory of development so that they can have meaningful livelihoods, but at the same time, not wreck the climate, the environment in which the food systems are produced? This is very, very important, because we do know that in the place that I'm talking to you from now, that the current practice is still slash and burn. You slash every 4 or 5 years, you burn everything to the ground so that you're hoping that you're getting some manure. What is the future of that kind of agriculture? I think those are important issues. What is the role of slash and burn to the climate? We need evidence, we need science, because when we have science-based action and policy, then we can now make proposals for positive change. I think this is an important area for researchers to think about. So the question is, how do we transform this smallholder agriculture under climate change so that people can also have meaningful livelihoods and be able to participate in national and international economies? So there are real issues there that we have to deal with. So what are some of the solutions? And I think we start to talk about transparency in the food system. We need transparency. Now, but the question then is, who is going to manage this transparency? What do we need for a transparent food system? We need data. Who is going to generate this data? Who is going to store this data? Who is going to manage this data? Who is going to interpret this data? And who is going to communicate this data? These are very, very important questions that we need to think about. And I think in Africa at the moment, the mantra is transform the smallholder agriculture. And I think we have to use all this information together to develop a proper trajectory for the transformation of smallholder agriculture. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really great points. Jillian, I'm going to you next. And this is an issue around which there has also been a lot of youth mobilization. So particularly interested here, but there are also a lot of conversations in general around climate change and industrial agriculture, and how animal agriculture in particular, industrial animal agriculture, is the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Can you talk about the link between the two?
Yes, thank you, Lana. I also wanted to remind our audience, if you have questions for any of the panelists or questions in general that we can answer, please put them on Facebook or in the Q&A if you're on Zoom. So thank you, Lana, for that question. So when we think about climate change and global warming, we tend to think of the fossil fuel industry. However, the global agricultural system is at the heart of both the problem and the solution. As industrial agriculture is the key driver in the generation of greenhouse gas emissions, from synthetic fertilizers to pesticides to heavy machinery and waste and transportation, these are all part of a food system that generates massive amounts of emissions and contributes to global climate change, which is now leading to an unhealthy food system across the world. So just to give you guys some numbers, we raise close to 70 billion animals annually for human consumption. That is a lot. If we think about the resources that are involved, the environmental impact on those animals alone for human consumption, that's massive. 1/3 of the world's grain production is used to feed livestock. And what we don't connect is the air and water pollution to the food that is on our plate. And this is why I continuously talk about we have the power to mitigate this climate crisis by what we put on our plates and consume. So air and water pollution can be directly attributed to the livestock sector, which is the largest contributor of global water pollution. So we have to fully understand that our food consumption and production is rapidly deteriorating the planet. The livestock sector alone, which again is something that I really hone in on, is one of the leading drivers of global deforestation. And it's linked to 75% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest alone. So to help mitigate this crisis, we have to address deforestation. We have to address land degradation, water pollution, biodiversity loss. If we don't think about all of these causes that are contributing to the climate crisis, then we are going to have a planet that will not be sustainable for generations to come. Cows alone produce about 150 billion gallons of methane per day. And 2,500 gallons of water are needed to produce 1 pound of beef. If we could all make more conscious decisions in what we're consuming, how we're consuming it, and solutions like regenerative agriculture can be a solution to the problem at hand. But we really need to make the connection between what we're eating for the health of ourselves, but for the planet as well, because the scientists will be right. We may only have 60 harvests left. And if we don't address soil degradation, if we don't address sequestering the carbon, if we don't address these things, then we will not have food to feed the world.
Thank you, Jillian. I think another notable report here for anyone who hasn't checked it out is the Eat Lancet Commission, which also found that it was completely necessary to look at these kinds of issues, and particularly shifting to more healthy, sustainable food consumption and planetary health diets, looking also at how what we eat impacts not only our health, but the planet, which will ultimately impact the futures of our health. So I think that's really, really important to have involved in the conversation as well. And last but not least, moving to my first question for Anna from the Regenerative Organic Alliance. Anna, regenerative farming, which Jillian just mentioned as well, is having quite a moment right now, and many people believe it can help transfer massive quantities of carbon from the atmosphere to the soil, which of course, very interesting. With pressure mounting to address the climate crisis, can regenerative agriculture prove a significant and permanent upheaval to traditional, conventional farming methods?
Thanks, Lana. Yep, there is mounting evidence that regenerative agriculture can play a key role in climate change mitigation and shifting agriculture away from being a major contributor to climate change. There are many scientists who have been working on this issue for decades, such as Dr. Tom Wall, who have done substantial research into this area around the ability for soil to sequester carbon and also to hold that and store that carbon for longer periods of time. But it is really only in recent years that regenerative agriculture and the idea of using soil to sequester carbon has become a mainstream idea. And so regenerative agriculture tends to use a number of key practices like crop rotation or vegetative cover to help rebuild soil health so that it's better able to retain that carbon. And right now, the main focus on regenerative agriculture is carbon sequestration, but it really does need to be about so much more than that. As Jillian mentioned, there are so many issues within our current agricultural paradigm, concerns around water, the need for more diverse food production, the long-term viability of the soil, habitat protection for wildlife, and we really have to look at regenerative agriculture and shifting the paradigm of agriculture to address these broader issues. It can't just be about carbon sequestration because then we'll end up in the same boat, in 5 years looking to figure out how we have fresh water to raise and grow crops. And I think one thing that's interesting and important to recognize about regenerative agriculture is it really is traditional farming. The practices that make up kind of the concept of regenerative agriculture are based in traditional and indigenous farming practices from around the globe. And it's really our modern years post World War II that have led us to this conventional chemical-based agricultural system that's been fueled by chemical companies and government policy, and really has kind of moved away from those traditional practices. And regenerative agriculture is a bit of a return to that knowledge base. So it does pose a lot of hope for not only climate change, but also just food security and creating an overall better food system.
Thank you, Anna. Definitely. It looks like we can agree that our conventional food system has to change. But how are we going to do that, right? There's lots of different ways. So switching gears a little bit for the second round of questions, Max, I'm going to go back to you. What are some of the ways that being part of the International Food Network created by Growing Hope locally has helped grassroots food systems become more resilient, both within the US and abroad as well?
Thank you, Lana. Great question. We didn't create anything, but we are a part of that ecosystem. We work with US farmers and their communities here to support farmers and their communities overseas. And we recognize that the best way of doing that isn't to ship grain from the United States or anywhere else, but rather to support them through the tools and training they need to be able to grow their own. And that support goes through our dozen partners that implement on the ground. They have local partners in more than the 24 or so countries where we support about 40 different programs. And the key is the needs of growing yams and sweet potatoes in Zambia are very different than growing mushrooms in Cambodia or vegetables in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. So there is no one size fits all. It's not like a farmer from Iowa who's growing corn and soybeans is going to be able to have the answers for that local farmer in Western Kenya. But what we do is provide the funding for basically ag extension agents in their local contexts. So farmers here are donating a portion of the proceeds of their harvest to support what the farmers overseas need to provide for their families. So I'll just give you one quick example. The program in Cambodia took subsistence rice farmers who were barely making it, and the husbands had to go and do day labor or work in the city and factories. And we were able to provide some funding through World Hope International to help them build mushroom houses. Well, they're not greenhouses, they're dark houses. And they're using the rice husks as the material to plant the mushroom spores in. Well, they grow quickly. It's a monthly growing cycle. So every 21 days they're harvesting, selling into the wholesale market in Phnom Penh. And they've gone from being subsistence farmers to being agricultural entrepreneurs. Their husbands can move home and be with the family. They're generating enough income, not just to survive, but to thrive. They've been able to reinvest in the pandemic response. So they're doing training, they're purchasing soap and PPE, great. But the other thing is environmentally, it's a win-win. They're using all of the rice husks that they used to just burn as that material, and they need more. So they're going to neighboring villages to purchase that and provide a secondary market that's both good for their income, good for their nutritional status because of increased incomes, and good for the environment. So if folks are interested, I put it in the chat, but Growing Hope globally, especially for those who are here in the US, we'd love to plug you in and partner that way, but excited for that and this opportunity.
Amazing work, Max. And of course, I encourage all the other panelists to also put in information about how people can find out more about their orgs and what they're doing in the chat as well. Next, I'll be going back to Sweta with a question about how for a while now there has been a lot of emphasis put on managing the risk, the gap in risk perception associated with food insecurity. Has COVID-19 changed this gap? And if so, how?
Yeah, so following up from what I was saying in the intro question, this is a really good time to try and better calibrate people. So when there isn't an infectious disease outbreak, nobody's scared about an infectious disease outbreak. People are so complacent to the point where even diseases we've eradicated globally are making a comeback because we feel we've just become that complacent. And that is something that until a disease rears its ugly head doesn't become obvious to us. So this whole concept of waiting for a vaccination and that really changing things is something that I really consider deeply, because look at the amount, especially in the United States, of people who actually take the flu vaccine every year. Look at the compliance to the flu vaccine, right? And I don't, from evidence and what we know about human behavior, it would not be surprising to see a similar non-compliance rate appear for the COVID vaccine over time. So complacency is a real issue, and it's why we overperceive and underperceive risk in aligned to the reality of the risk. We often overreact to certain risks because we don't actually take the time to understand the base rate statistics of that risk, and we underreact to other risks, like the potential for a disease outbreak to occur, like the impacts of climate change, like the potential for our homes to get flooded because of sea level rise. These are the kinds of risks that we are just not well aligned to, and that's how our brains are wired. So given the opportunity right now, post-COVID emergence, is to really better align that perception and the reality. And that is so critical, because what I was saying again in the intro is this is not going to go away. This is something, COVID is something we are going to learn to live with. It's going to be one of the many risks that we coexist with in our very complex, interconnected global risk landscape. The same way we've gotten accustomed to HIV as a regular infectious disease, we will find ourselves living with COVID and additional infectious diseases that we haven't even come across yet. So for that reason, it is so critical to really put in place behaviors that we can normalize and that will persist. Basic hygiene, right? We now are finding communities around the world that never would have thought about wearing a mask or washing their hands, doing it on the regular. Those kinds of behaviors need to persist because of learnings and because of the reality of the risks we're facing, because we know what's going to come in the future. And same thing with food. This is the time to put in good behaviors, to take advantage of the fact that the perception is aligning to the reality. And let's stop behaviors like encroaching on habitats and natural environments that historically we haven't interacted with, that have resulted in a mixing across species of viruses across species that has resulted in a zoonotic disease transfer from animal to human, which then from human to human transmission is what we see today with COVID-19. We can improve our human behavior interactions with the natural environment, with animals, and the combination of, I'm so sorry, this is what I was talking about, my Zoom being all messed up because of my Apple upgrade recently. I apologize. But this is the time that we really can take advantage of improving upon reality and perception and instituting behaviors that will persist. I'll leave it there.
Beautiful, Sweta. I completely agree. It's difficult because this is super unfortunate, and it's horrible that we're in a pandemic and all these things are happening. At the same time, this is an opportunity. This is the time that we should, we've finally taken a step back from business as usual, even after we were saying we need to change the way we're conducting society. It was finally a global pandemic that made us do it. So I think this is really the time to reflect on if we want to return to business as usual, the way we're conducting things, exactly the same.
Exactly. And it's not an option. So let's take advantage of it. Let's put in good practices now.
Right. This is the time. Next, I'm going to be going back to Linus. Linus, as sustainability is becoming more urgent, solutions such as agricultural biotechnology are discussed, but many have reservations. What can be done to facilitate educational exchange between members in the food system about sustainability and possible solutions? Linus, you're muted.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think in discussing the issue of sustainability of our food system and the need for education and interaction among the stakeholders, I just want to go back briefly to the title of this webinar, The Rising Battle for Food. And I think if we spend some time to really examine this ongoing battle for food, I don't think it's an upcoming battle. The battle is already going on. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there is no other place to look at to see better examples about this rising battle for food and the need for global solidarity. Can you hear me still? Bandwidth is low.
Yes.
Yes, Linus.
Can you? Okay, thank you. So if you move around some of the major cities in Africa, like Abuja, the capital of Nigeria, or Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, you are most likely going to run into a herd of cattle and the herdsmen moving this around near the cities, looking for food, looking for feed, managing the traffic with the vehicles, cars, and looking for grass to feed their animals. You would have probably heard on the news, especially coming out of Nigeria, about ongoing and continuing clashes between the farmers and the nomadic herdsmen. These conflicts are spreading. These conflicts are real. And so this battle for fertile land and water is also a battle for food. It is also a battle for livelihoods. So these resulting clashes between local farmers and nomadic herdsmen has epitomized the confluence of climate change and the need for action. And that action has to be now. So these attacks and clashes and the counter attacks become hotspots for disharmony and have become fault lines in the unity of nations like Nigeria. So just like we have the climate action for climate change, I think we need action now to really deal with this issue of battle for food. It is very, very real. So what is the way forward? We need to look for sustainable solutions. So we talked about sustainable agriculture, we talk about sustainable food systems, but how do we achieve these sustainable solutions? We need science and technology. We need science, we need facts, we need evidence. We don't need the other 3 Fs of fear, fake, and fiction competing with facts. We have to elevate the single F, facts, above the 3 Fs of fear, fiction, and fake. What does that mean in terms of solution for this rising battle for food? It means that we have to rely on science. We have to seek for evidence to help us develop a new food system and a sustainable agriculture. So traditionally, in the poor food, you clear more forests, you clear more land, you wipe away even people. That was called extensification. We have enough evidence now that is no longer allowable. It is not good, it is not sustainable, it's going to collapse this planet, and we don't want that. So what is the solution? The solution, one way of the solution is what we call sustainable intensification. What does that mean? It means we want to get more harvest per unit of our land, per unit of input, more harvest per drop. But how do we achieve that? We need science. We need good management practices. We need technologies that have been tested and proven that work, that make changes in the lives of people. There should be no exclusion of technologies. Everything must be on the table, so long as it is good science. So there's no reason why biotechnology should not be on the table, both for smallholder farmers in Africa and any other farmer around the world, whether they're smallholder, medium scale, or large scale. Those are the 2 first ones. Extensification, no. Sustainable intensification, yes. But the 3rd one that I always like to propose is what I call post-harvestification. I did mention earlier that about $48 billion annually due to food that is produced that doesn't reach the consumer. And at the same time, Africa imports about $35 billion of food. So if you do the arithmetic for those in business, it makes good business sense to save the house. So when you hear about statistics that we need to grow 70% more food, and I said, what happens to the other 50% that we are losing? Wouldn't it be better and cheaper, more environmentally friendly, make the climate much better, make the planet much better, to save what we have already invested resources to produce? So those must become part of our basket of actions. So what is the how? The wide range of technologies that are available, including biotechnology. I've attended a lot of debates and meetings and discussions about the future of agriculture in Africa. And when you talk about biotechnology, people put their hands on their head and think this is something for somewhere else. But I remember that about microwave, simple microwave technology that is used to warm food now, that is very common in most homes. 30, 40 years ago, people didn't want it near their homes because they thought that it was going to kill babies. We also heard about the response to electricity about 100 years back. People didn't want electricity in their homes because it was supposed to be this invading, non-visible technology that will kill the next generation. But how many of us will live today without electricity? So what my proposal is that we must have all technologies available on the deck, guided by science and evidence. But now we need to communicate this science. We need to make sure that people understand. But how do we do that? We need to bring science much nearer, closer to people. For example, we heard about farmer field schools in India, for example, during the Green Revolution in the 50s and 60s. And we know the impact it had in bringing science closer to people when you have high-yielding varieties. So people can feel science. People need to feel science. People need to feel those facts and test them in their local conditions so that you have a better chance of them adopting them. We need to begin to do adaptive research closer to the people, to the end users. It won't be something that looks like it's made for people in another planet. If you consider the food insecurity problem in the world, and Africa continues to be the main hotspots, Africa and the African friends embrace good science to develop Africa. This is very, very important. So those are some of the areas, the issue of communication, issue of science on the ground, local science that provides evidence for the people to see the transformative effect of science in their business, in their livelihoods, and in their well-being. Those are some of the areas that I think we need to take action. Thank you, Lana.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Linus. Yes, that is super, super important as we look to tackle these huge problems effectively and at scale. For my final question, before we go on to the Q&A and see what audience questions we've received, Anna, I'd love to hear from you about how countries such as France are promoting large-scale government programs to encourage farmers to increase the carbon stored in soil, and members of US Congress have also proposed legislation to push regenerative farming in the US, and several states are designing their own policies. What can we hope to see from policymakers to encourage regenerative agriculture?
Lana, yeah, there's a lot of great things happening at the policy level. You have the 4x1000 initiative in France, which was launched in 2015. There are pieces of legislation being introduced in Congress here in the United States. The House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis just released a 450-page report that included regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture as potential solutions to help mitigate climate change. In California, there's the Healthy Soils program. And these are all really great initiatives, but they're not currently happening at the scale and being implemented at the scale that we truly need. You know, for example, we just passed the Farm Bill in the US in 2018, which sets the policy in the United States, but also has to do with, you know, food aid throughout the world from the US. And that's $428 billion over 5 years. And the majority of that is going to conventional agriculture. It's supporting business as usual, and it's not addressing the problems. And so one of the challenges is policy is slow to happen and slow to be implemented, but it does have huge potential. If that $428 billion was shifted towards regenerative and organic agriculture, we would see drastic change in the food system and how food is produced both in the United States and globally. And that that type of funding also funds, research at universities. As Linus mentioned, we need more research. Research has been very focused on large monocrop conventional agriculture systems, and that's not how most of the food is grown in this world. Smallholders are a huge part of that. And so shifting our research to provide more backing for these policy changes is hugely important as well. And these policy changes do also need to address labor and food access and water and dead zones. So it really does need to go beyond carbon sequestration. And I think, the House bill on climate change, the climate crisis, is a great example of that and what France has committed to. And I think policy is hugely important and obviously sets the stage. Consumers are hugely important and they do make decisions. But at the end of the day, climate change is hugely caused by very large corporations. And until those corporations shift their practices, there's going to be slow to change. And I think we're seeing at the Regenerative Organic Alliance, we manage certification, Regenerative Organic Certified, and we're getting a lot of interest from large companies that are looking to incorporate regenerative organic agriculture in their supply chains as part of their plan to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I think there is hope in the area of policy, both federally and locally and internationally, hope in consumers changing perspective and engagement, and hope in businesses. I think the big challenge is we don't have a lot of time. There is a huge urgency behind the action efforts we need to take around climate change, and it can be hard and slow to implement change in agricultural production. And we need to act now, just as Linus said.
We really do. And I think that conversation around corporations contributing to the climate crisis is really interesting, especially in a food systems panel, because I feel like the really powerful climate movements that I've been a part of, right, like the youth climate strikes, have focused a lot on the oil and gas companies that are contributing to the climate crisis, but not so much on big agricultural industries and conventional industrial agriculture, and how that is also a major contributor to the climate crisis. And I've seen some studies recently about that too, how those companies are contributing just as much or more than oil and gas companies. So also really, really important to talk about. And now I want to move on to some of the questions that we've received throughout the panel. And one of the first ones I want to go to that we received from Facebook is, the question says, I am a coordinator for a mutual aid collective in Iowa. We are currently in the US. We are currently organizing to create a more sustainable local food system. We have been sending out meals to unhoused people and those impacted by COVID since March, but recognize our limitation in terms of being dependent on the current food supply chain. We have some local farmers and community gardeners involved. What advice would you give to a group like ours that is just getting started? And feel free, anyone I know who's interested, to take this question.
Yeah, Lana, I'm happy to. I put a couple resources in the chat for our friend from Facebook who asked this. Matt Russell of Coyote Run Farms in Iowa is a great resource. He also runs Interfaith Power and Light there in Iowa. The Emergency Food Response Network, so food banks and food pantries are the way the United States has responded to the hunger program. They're not so integrated with the food production world. Oftentimes it's just rescuing food from grocery stores or large food producers. But another group called Ample Harvest, so ampleharvest.org, connects small growers, usually gardeners, with extra produce with those who need it, often through food pantries or other efforts like what the friend in Iowa has described. So those are two resources to help.
Thank you, Max. Would anyone else like to jump into this question, or else I'll move on to our next one? Okay, well, these are great resources. And so we hope that our listener will be able to check that out and work on their sustainable local food system. It's, of course, a great effort. Another question we received specifically referencing how Sweta referenced the cultural differences that make global answers more difficult. And also they said that Jillian spoke about the need for a switch to a more plant-based diet. How will this be brought about? So Jillian and Sweta, I'd especially love to hear from you, but also anyone else who would like to jump in.
Sure, I'll start then. This actually plays into another question I saw in the chat on trust. And we have to remember, from an evolutionary biology, anthropology, sociology point of view, our brains and the way we interact with one another is still very much the way our ancestors did. Our environment, our landscape, our technology, including the problems I have with it sometimes, are a modern day marvels. And they are not even close, our brain has not even come close to catching up to the reality of the speed at which we have changed the landscape around us. So we still need trust. We still need those one-on-one relationships, which is increasingly harder to do as society develops and globalizes. And as we depend on institutions to deliver us our food, regulators who we don't have direct relationships with, companies that we perceive some sort of conflict of interest potentially. This all erodes that trust, but that doesn't change the fact that we still need it to be able to make better decisions for ourselves, for our health, our bodies, our families, our communities. So what's really critical and what's really missing, and we've been having this conversation, Linus and I met because we were working on food and agriculture issues, almost a decade ago at this point. And so that just goes to show we've been having a lot of these similar conversations for a really long time. And what's tends to continue to be missing is the need to really invest and engage in developing those relationships and increasing that trust so as we can predict better behavioral outcomes in terms of dietary choices or real recognition and awareness of where people's food is coming from, people's behaviors, interacting with the environment, interacting with potential food sources, choosing to eat more vegan meals than not. These are the kinds of things that really require building relationships with those who can create those choices for that final end consumer. And so Linus also hit it on the head. Communication. We really need communication as the tool to build that trust. And we need better communication and we need engagement as well. It's not one-way communication. That's where we failed. Scientists have just kind of said the data, disseminated the information, as opposed to engaging. And that engagement is really critical to understand what are the different values, what are the different inputs that are unique to specific cultures within and across regions. And so we're going to find differences across communities, and that's okay, that's the point, we're not uniform. But then based on that, how do we communicate information that is relevant and will be interpreted so that people can use the information hasn't changed. The science, the data from the experts won't change, but it's how it's communicated to these different demographics across cultures, across borders that will
Jillian, do you want to speak more to your side while we wait for Sweta to come back with her Zoom updates?
Yes. Yeah, so what she was saying in terms of behaviors, and I think this was asked a couple times in the chat as well, will
really result in then successful behavior. I'll leave it there.
Oh, so sorry, Sweta. We missed a portion of you what you were saying at the end there.
But it's
Shoot,
okay.
I'm sorry, guys. Can you hear me?
Now we could.
Okay, I'm sorry. Where did I cut off?
We lost like the last 38 seconds.
Oh, wow. I really got animated too in the last 30 seconds. The real takeaway is that we can use science as a tool to build that trust. It cannot be a one-way, just like dissemination of information. That's what we've gotten wrong. That's what scientists have done. The facts don't change, but just delivering the facts to people without taking into account all the different inputs that will affect the interpretation of those facts means that the communication efforts could potentially be futile. So it's really important when we communicate to recognize cultural differences, individual differences, community differences, recognize what values are important to those different individuals and communities, and develop communications to address that. And then we can begin to create better, those types of strategies for communication will inevitably result in more trust. And then ultimately then we can begin to predict better behavioral outcomes. And that's what we want, right? We want people to be informed and make decisions based on evidence. But we need to get better at how we do that. And it needs to be through communication and through engagement.
I agree, and I'll just piggyback on that by saying, and there were some questions in the chat about if I'm vegan and advocating for a plant-based diet. While yes, I'm vegan, it doesn't mean that I'm telling every single person in the world they should be vegan. Would our planet be better for it? Sure, but it's not as easy as that. So I encourage people to alter their behaviors a little bit, even if it's going plant-based once a week. Even those small steps would help towards a better future. So it's not all or nothing. We shouldn't have to kind of critique people. I think we're all trying to do the best that we could with the information that we have. And if we continue to educate ourselves with what is happening with the food systems and what the deterioration of the planet, then we can make, like Sweta said, better informed decisions. So thanks, Lana.
Definitely, that's a great note. And with just a few minutes left now, I just open up a space for anyone else who wants to address a question on, I was going to mention a question on controlling climate change, but Linus, if you want to make some comments, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make a comment because, we're running out of time. I think there was some question online that talked about the role of industries on this issue here. And I think my experience is that industries have a huge role to play. For example, the area of cleaner energy, not just clean energy. Many companies are very hesitant to invest for the future. They just want to invest for the immediate bottom line. So companies have responsibilities over cleaner energy for the future, more efficient of bioresources. For current industry practice may require you to use 10 tons to produce 1 ton of an item. But through efficient bioresource utilization, utilizing science and technology, it is possible for us to do better. We have the science, they're already available. And companies have to take greater responsibility about the planet and not just the bottom line of cash. The last point I would like to make is this battle for food is also a battle for our climate and our planet. I think we need to make those linkages, that the current battle for food, as I've shown you some of the evidence in Nigeria and Africa, is also the battle for our climate. It is also the battle for peace. So it's not just about food. There is increasing relationship between food security, peace, and climate. So we need to make those. Overall, we want to make sure that we let science and facts guide us, both our policies and our interventions, and technology that is appropriately well applied has an important role to play. And we need to find a way to domesticate this science and technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Linus. I'd love to also pass it on to Anna. I feel like we haven't heard from you in a little bit. If you want to address any of the questions that have been made about regenerative agriculture, or make any last remarks. I saw some questions about how people can get involved in supporting regenerative agriculture, even if they don't own land, for example.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways that people can get involved in regenerative agriculture. At the end of the day, there's both engaging with the brands that you purchase food from. There are ways to, connect in with your local farmers. There are lots of farmers throughout the world that are practicing regenerative agriculture, and they're not just necessarily claiming it on a large scale. And so if you aren't visiting the farms in your area, or you don't even know if there are farms in your area, that's just a great place to start in learning more about your local food shed. And then also there's a huge opportunity to engage with your policy and decision makers, both at the local, state or regional and federal level. Here in the United States, citizens have a huge opportunity to speak with their members of Congress, and those are the people who set the policy and set the decisions for what agricultural system we support. So if you're not engaging in a conversation about regenerative agriculture and organic food production, I would say that is an excellent place to start. And even just having those conversations with your own community, it's obviously a little harder right now in COVID to gather around the table with people and talk about the food that you're eating. But that's an essential place to start. And in any opportunity to shift the food that you're consuming, as Jillian mentioned, there's a lot of ways to make small and meaningful changes in what you're supporting that way, but also just learning about where the food that you're eating is coming from.
Yes, there's so much that everyone can do. You don't have to be a producer or a farmer or already part of expertise in food systems or engaging with that every day. Obviously, we're all interactive and are part of a food system just by being alive and just by consuming food. So there's so much that everyone can do. And I'm going to also pass it on to Max for any final thoughts as we wrap up here.
So there's a passage in the Christian scriptures of the Bible that says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers or the workers are few. So taking that not in a theological context, but in an actual context, we can end hunger. Hunger is one of the greatest global challenges for which there is a cure. We know what to do. We just need more people doing it. So I am excited, Lana, that you have made this decision in your young life to engage with the rest of us and this issue in particular. I would invite all of our participants to do whatever it is that's their part in reaching the goal of achieving zero hunger. And for those in the US who are interested, Growing Hope Globally is just one of many ways of doing that.
Perfect. Nice, quick, concise, got to the point. Yes, I hope everyone else will join us. We need everyone's voices in this. We're talking about World Food Day tomorrow, the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit, where there will be dialogues in every country, and we want every single person involved. So Sweta, I'd just love to also hear from you. Any final thoughts you'd like to bring in?
Yeah, I would say a final takeaway is really that people need to make better choices as individuals. It's the responsibility of anyone who has a stake in the food system to be able to communicate that information, so people are armed with the best information as they make choices 3 times a day, if they're lucky, about the food that they're going to be putting into their bodies and to those of their loved ones. It tends to be the women of households that make these decisions for themselves and their families. And so they deserve to have the best information. And that is bottom up and top down. We need to create that global infrastructure. That's why we've elected our policymakers to represent us at those top levels. So it's so important also for all of you involved in this that are participating because you care, to get out, to vote, to represent yourselves and your communities at that highest governance level, because we do need to see real shifts in infrastructure change, because better options need to be available to people as well. So they can, it's not just about expecting people to choose, it's also giving them good options to choose from. So bottom up and top down will be really critical in seeing this transformation happen successfully.
Yes, definitely. We need to demand better, and we also need to make the efforts in our lives to do what we can to be healthier, more sustainable, supporting better food systems. And that doesn't just mean what you eat, but also policy and advocacy. So I want to tell everyone who submitted questions, there were too many, and there's just simply no way we'll get to all of them. But I do want to let you know that all the questions will be answered afterwards via email in a follow-up. And also I want to thank all of our amazing panelists, of course, and also the support, tech support from Earth Day, from Holiday there, and our audience for joining us. Everyone else who is listening in, thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it to Jillian for final concluding remarks as we log out today.
No, we are over time, but thank you everyone for joining this important discussion. And as tomorrow is World Food Day, I hope we all could take a moment to reflect on what each of us are doing for the betterment of ourselves and the planet. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a good day, everyone, and stay safe.